90 law professors take a very kind of above the fray, whatever your politics, regardless, many of us may agree or disagree about some of these individual actions, but they essentially say we're united in our concern for the rule of law. And this screed by the 90 professors is taken on by a single Harvard law professor, Adrian Vermeule, in an open letter to my students. And I just want to focus in on one part of this letter because it so effectively capsizes or refutes what these 90 Harvard legal eagles are saying. Professor Vermeule basically goes, listen, he goes, it was unprecedented what we've seen in the last 4 years. Federal prosecutors launched a battery of charges against a former president who also happened to be the leading opponent of the incumbent president. He goes, what did we hear from these 90 Harvard law professors at that point? Not a word. He goes, where were they when Jeff Clark, Rudy Giuliani, John Eastman, other lawyers who had represented Trump and Trump interests were threatened with disbarment, in some cases prosecuted for their representation of Trump? He goes, was this not a threat to the rule of law? And then Professor Vermeule pulls back and he goes, well, of course, I know what these guys are going to say. They're my colleagues after all. I know them. I see them at lunch every day. I know what they're going to say. They're going to say, well, those prosecutions were actually warranted. Of course, we went after Trump on many different grounds because this guy commits crimes in many different grounds. So we went after him justly and appropriately. We were holding up the rule of law in what we did. And then Professor Vermeule says, okay, so what you're really saying is that the law, as you call it, is what you take to be the law. It's your interpretation of the law, and you're conflating your interpretation of the law with the law itself. If anybody doesn't agree with your interpretation of the law, then they're against the rule of law. And he goes, look, two people can play at that game because we can take exactly the same view, which is that the law is what we say it is. So if we're going after these students and they resist, they're against the rule of law. If we go after these law firms and bring them to their knees and they make agreements and so on with us, that's because what we say is the law and they are opposing the rule of law. So Professor Vermeule's point here is, and he puts it beautifully, the central vice of the collective letter is that it is tendentious, meaning one-sided. It appropriates a shared ideal and turns it to sectarian ends. So the shared ideal is the rule of law. And it turns it to sectarian ends, meaning the rule of law is what we say it is. The rule of law is what benefits our side. If it benefits your side, it's not the rule of law. You're against the rule of law. Implicitly dubs anyone who disagrees as an opponent of the rule of law altogether. In other words, it essentially creates the idea that all talk about the rule of law becomes a political sham, which is sometimes, I have to confess my feeling about these matters. It's like, listen, whenever someone says, it's like what Samuel Johnson said, is that when he hears the word patriotism, he said, is the last refuge of a scoundrel. Now, he didn't mean that patriotism itself is bad. What he meant is that whenever someone says, you're unpatriotic, and they define as unpatriotic the fact that my interests, my view of what benefits the country is not shared by you, therefore you're unpatriotic. You can see it's exactly the same thing going on here.